Welcome today at the Max-Planck-Institut for the History of Science. My name is Dagmar Schäfer. I'm at the moment the executive director and was asked by the organizers of the Institute's Colloquium to give you a short, if only virtual, welcome to the new round of our Institute's Colloquium. And I would like to start by having us all think a little bit about the difference between an occupational group and a community of practice. In organizational sciences and the history of technology, people have defined an occupational community as I quote, a group of people who consider themselves to be engaged in the same sort of work, who identify more or less positively with their work, who share a set of values, norms, and perspectives that apply to but extend beyond work-related matters, and whose social relationships meld the realms of work and leisure. Quote end. That we meet today on this platform is caused by issues of safety, a safety defined by an agreement of acceptable attitudes, beliefs, perceptions, behaviors, norms, and values and assumptions. The way we do things around here. Over the course of now already 1 year, we do things differently than we did before, which has changed our view of working, learning, and innovation as well. We have grown from an occupational group also to a community of practice, a group of people who get the job done in new ways, virtually, in groups that wish to discuss themes, irrespective of where they geographically are located at the moment and in which time zones they are. Over the last year, all you're here and many in the background contributed immeasurably into this joint effort to get the job done. People sustained old and developed new ties to form a strong community that can weather the storm. I'm pleased therefore, to welcome you all back into this community of practice, the virtual Institute's Colloquium today. Our series begins with some, I think, very insightful contributions and promising insights that critically engage with the boundary drawing that defines all communities, how redrawing these boundaries can be stimulating and inspiring, how technologies have consequences for such communities, human and non-human, and ecologies are affected by it. Everything we can do to make you feel welcome here at home at the Max-Planck-Institut for the Histories of Science in this discourse, we will happily do.
My name is Lisa Onaga. I am a senior research scholar here at the Max-Planck-Institut for the History of Science, and I'll be chairing today's session. So let's take a look at what day we're at. It's Tuesday, March the 23rd, 2021. And officially, I would like to welcome you back to the Institute's Colloquium for our theme of crisis and capacity perspectives in the history, in the humanities and social sciences. And in this year's Colloquium series, we've been bringing together researchers in history of science and in other disciplines from different parts of the world to think about the broader and deeper issues that connect to COVID-19 and how COVID-19 helps inform and makes us think about our research and our research methods. So as we speak, new variants of the virus are spreading through Germany and are placing pressures on pandemic control in the face of a troubled vaccine rollout program. And the stricter and extended lockdowns announced just today by the Chancellor are thought to help recover time to vaccinate the population and break the exponential rates of the third wave, essentially a new pandemic brought on by the mutated virus. Today's topic of environments and ecologies of transmission contextualizes these numbered waves of infection by looking more deeply into the histories of the second and third plague pandemics since the 14th century that decenter humans and bring animals, climate, and ecologies and planetary health into the foreground. Today, we're honored to be joined by our three panelists, Doctors Nicole de Paula, Christos Lynteris, and Nükhet Varlık, to discuss their brilliant research at the forefront of these topics. I'm sure we'll learn a lot from their methodological insights. Before my colleague Christoph Rosol, leader of the Knowledge in and of the Anthropocene Working Group, introduces all of the speakers at once, we have some housekeeping notes. We are recording the talks and the panel discussions of the speakers only. Each speaker will have their micro lecture for about 20 minutes. That's going to be followed by a group discussion amongst the speakers. And then we'll open up the floor to Q&A, which will be moderated by my co-coordinator, Stephanie Hood. And there will be a Etherpad link that you can click on to list your question. You may do that anonymously or with your name, however you wish. And we'd like to also thank Verena Braun and Aaron Richmond in the communications team and the library, who has helped collate and share the intranet of the MPIWG website publications by our three panelists. So if you're interested, you can look into that a little further. So Christoph.
Now, our first presenter is Nicole de Paula, inaugural Klaus Töpfer Sustainability Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam. Nicole de Paula holds a PhD in International Relations from Sciences Po Paris and has devoted her academic career to globally connect policymakers and researchers to create a public understanding on key issues related to sustainability and public health. In that, she has become a strong advocate for the integrative approach of planetary health, a newly emerging public health paradigm that takes the reciprocal relationship into account that exists between ecosystem integrity, genetic diversity, and climate change on the one hand, and diseases such as cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses, but also issues such as malnutrition and unsustainable food systems on the other hand. Previous of her work, Nicole de Paula was the director of a think tank in Bangkok, Thailand, a French embassy fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C., and a researcher at the London School of Economics as part of the Global Public Policy Network. Nicole de Paula champions the socio-economic advancement of women through environmental conservation and public health policies. She is the founder of the Women Leaders for Planetary Health and co-founder of an interdisciplinary research group on planetary health at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Finally, she is currently a member of the committee preparing the global meeting of the Planetary Health Alliance, a consortium of over 200 research and government entities committed to addressing global environmental change and its health impacts. The meeting is to be held virtually, of course, at the end of the coming month in Brazil, Nicole's home country, from which we receive quite disturbing reports these days that its intensive care system is at the brink of collapse due to the P1 virus variant. This daunting phase of academic life with the possibility of public meltdown leaves me to add one further note here. Just last year, Dr. de Paula was one of the presenters at a discussion series that a few members of our department regularly organize as the prelude to the annual meetings of the Scientific Council of the Max-Planck Society. The series is called Basic Research for a Livable Future and is our attempt to make questions of inclusive sustainability more prominent among the varied Max-Planck research strands. Now, eerie coincidence has it that the evening event took place towards the end of February in 2020, at a moment when the coronavirus was already spreading across the globe, even if still somewhat unheedingly watched over in the Western Hemisphere. The event was dedicated to the subject of planetary health, with the subtitle, Handling Contradictions While Providing Solutions. And Nicole's talk decidedly focused on the problem of advancing the conceptual paradigm of planetary health in times of contested multilateralism. It is both humbling and sobering at the same time to see some of the contradictions discussed becoming all too visible and the struggle for cooperative solutions all too inadequate as we became overrun by a global pandemic just a few days later. So in this sense, it is of great avail to be able to welcome you back, Nicole, and to get an update on the state of the discussion on planetary health and how COVID-19 should be understood as a turning point for science and policy making alike. So thank you very much, Nicole, for joining us today. Now, I'm equally honored to present also our second speaker, Christos Lynteris. Dr. Christos Lynteris is a medical anthropologist based at the University of St. Andrews, located at Scotland's beautiful East Coast. As a senior lecturer in the Department of Social Anthropology, he has a strong inclination towards historicizing his subject of interest, which he circumscribes as epidemiological epistemology, the emergence of zoonosis, medical visual culture, colonial medicine, and generally pandemics as events posing an existential risk to humanity. In all of these matters, Dr. Lynteris takes a non-Eurocentric standpoint with a strong focus on Central and East Asia. Christos Lynteris' early works examined, amongst others, epidemic crises in modern China and their impact on society and governance, the role of SARS in the People's Republic of China, the social ecology of plague on the Chinese-Russian frontier, marmot hunting practices amongst Mongols and Buryats, and the impact on the zoonotic transmission of plague. He recently completed the 5-year project, Visual Representations of the Third Plague Pandemic, which collected and analyzed photographs and other visual documents of the last of the great bubonic plague pandemics, lasting basically from the middle of the 19th until the middle of the 20th century, and from which we can look forward to hear much more today. The fourth and final volume of that project, edited by our distinguished speaker, is coming out just these weeks, titled Plague Image and Imagination from Medieval to Modern Times. It nicely examines the visual record of the plague and explores the relationships between the epidemic image and human imagination. The new project Dr. Lynteris is now leading is titled Global War Against Threat and Epistemic Emergence of Zoonosis, and is funded by the Wellcome Trust until 2024. In that project, he examines the global development of scientific, laboratory, and field studies of the rat as a host or a vector of infectious diseases such as the plague, leptospirosis, and marine typhus. The project seeks to understand how the rat was transformed into an epistemic object for epidemiology, and how this process led to ways of knowing animal to human infection, and therefore to the emergence and consolidation of the epistemic field of zoonosis. I think the significance of this work cannot be overstated in light of the current spread of the most famous or infamous zoonotic disease since the bubonic plague, namely SARS-CoV-2. And I personally would be very curious to have Dr. Lynteris' informed opinion on A, the exceptional rise of zoonotic diseases over the last decades as an indicator for the issues that we will touch upon in the first presentation, and B, his stance on the current state of the discussion on the bat to pangolin to human transmission at the Wuhan market. Maybe we will have time towards the end of this colloquium to discuss some of these links as well. In line with these more applied questions, Dr. Lynteris is also a co-investigator of the 3-year research project developing effective rodent control strategies to reduce disease risk in ecological and culturally diverse rural landscapes, which is funded by the UK Research and Innovation Medical Research Council. The project aims to reduce the risk from rodent-borne infections and improve health and well-being by increasing the capacity to develop rodent control measures that are sustainable and resilient given local ecological, epidemiological, agricultural, and social cultural contexts, and focuses mainly on work with rural communities in Tanzania and Madagascar. Thanks also for joining us today, Dr. Lynteris, and we look very forward to your presentation in a few minutes. Now, with our third speaker, we stay with the plague as an epistemic object, but shift our geographical focus to the Ottoman Empire and our temporal focus to the second pandemic, if not to an alternative periodization altogether. I'm very pleased to now also welcome Dr. Nükhet Varlık, Associate Professor of History at the University of South Carolina and Rutgers University at Newark. Dr. Varlyk's interest is broadly situated in the history of medicine and public health and deals with the histories of disease in Ottoman society. Her first book, the prize-winning Plague and Empire in the Early Modern Mediterranean World, The Ottoman Experience 1347 to 1600, was published by Chicago University Press in 2015 and is the first systematic scholarly study of how plague interacted with the environmental, the social and political structures of the Ottoman Empire from the late medieval through the early modern era. In 2017, Nükhet Varlık then published the volume Plague and Contagion in the Islamic Mediterranean, which collected a wonderful set of essays, among them from our own Adna Bonhomme, that put plague and other communicable diseases in a wider context of the Islamic world of the Eastern Mediterranean, while also reflecting on appropriate methodological and historiographical issues in the history of epidemics at large. Now, in her new book project called Empire, Ecology and Plague, Rethinking the Second Pandemic, Dr. Varlık examines the 600-year Ottoman plague experience in a global ecological context, a scope from which I hope we will learn much more today. In conjunction with this research, Nükhet Varlık is involved in developing the Black Death Digital Archive, tracking the evolutionary and geographical history of Yersinia pestis across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. In that capacity, she contributes to multidisciplinary research projects that incorporate perspectives from paleogenetics, bioarchaeology, disease ecology, and climate science into historical inquiry, a dynamic field for which I'm sure that we have at least one eminent expert sitting in our audience today, if Adam Istevsky is with us today. Besides these varied publication projects, Nükhet Varlık is editor of the Journal of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association and has been teaching at James Madison University and Rutgers University in Newark. Also, for you, thank you very much for joining us today. And now we start with our panelists. The ether is yours.
Thank you so much for this kind invitation. It's good afternoon from Berlin. It's always an honor to be invited by the Max-Planck-Institut for the History of Science. And it's an honor mixed a little bit of excitement and a bit of fear, because this excitement, of course, I feel there's a real space to have in-depth conversations, and this fear because as a known historian, I always feel that I didn't dig deep enough. But with these colleagues, I'm very anxious for the second talks for the two colleagues, bringing this historical perspective on plagues and past pandemics. So I'll use my time today. I'll not use slides, do something different than the Zoom life we all have been living. And I want to use my time then to share how this COVID-19 pandemic open a window of opportunity to reframe this understanding of human health in Anthropocene. And the term, of course, being used to describe this human unprecedented change in our geological transformations. So my talk is very much about this political debates that we are having, and it's also very interesting to see that when I was speaking at Max Planck last year, just 1 month before we were all in lockdown. So it was a very interesting evolution, and at least a rise in interest, of course, of this conversation. So, and I'm going to focus today on the notion of planetary health and how this could be a chance to move away and towards a more what we call green economy, a resilient post-pandemic world. And I hope this post-pandemic world arrives. It's looking a bit far for us at the moment. But to do that, I want to discuss the planetary health, both from the scientific perspective and the social movement perspective. And we do, I think it was mentioned in this introduction, how these shocking numbers of the coronavirus remain very high. And of course, we need radical collaboration at the moment. And I'm speaking from Europe, and we're talking about this third wave, but it was noticed, I'm from Brazil. And in my country, we're talking perhaps about the first wave. It's a bit of a reset since this virus has a new variant there. And of course, Brazil is now in the media being perceived as a global threat. Also interesting to note that in terms of vaccinations, we are also giving more vaccines than the whole Europe, except for the UK. So there's a lot of discussions out there that we can maybe perhaps use the debate time to evaluate a little bit of the conditions of these regions. So no one can say when this pandemic will be over, what kind of consequences we'll have to deal with. But despite several open questions, I think there is one undisputable truth at the moment, that our nature is a bit of an attack. And that's how this phrase of the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he posts like, this is suicidal. Nature always strikes back, and it's already doing so with growing force and fury. So with so much on the media about these vaccines, and it's easy to forget the root causes of the pandemics. And that's why I'm also very curious to see how our colleagues will be framing that. But if you want to, today I want to bring this idea that the root cause of this pandemic is linked to this unsustainable patterns of development and this perhaps notion of suicidal attack against nature. And to demonstrate that, I want to describe then a little bit the notion of planetary health, explain why this matters specifically now in this moment of crisis, and target an area that I think we have the highest chance to apply this concept, a little bit focused on the low-hanging fruits. So how many times did you hear that COVID-19 is a wake-up call? And if it's many, I apologize, but I think it is a wake-up call. It's to rethink how we are perceiving human health. And despite the history that we're going to see with my colleagues soon, there is still, at least in my experience and professional life, a lot of resistance to frame this human health in line with environmental studies. But we are witnessing how the COVID-19 has really magnified these underlying systemic problems, including social and economic inequality, of course, demonstrating all the weaknesses of healthcare systems, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries. So how can sustainable development policies proactively address this interrelated challenge to improve human health? That's one of the main questions that we pose as planetary health experts or enthusiasts. And how can then healthcare systems also become more mindful of these imperatives of nature protection that we've been hearing nowadays? So, of course, we will say there are no healthy people in a sick planet, but is this really a new idea? Is it even an acceptable claim? So for planetary health experts and enthusiasts, of course, COVID-19 must be perceived as this turning point. So let me explain a little bit what I understand as this turning point. At the beginning of the pandemic, I think the world was shocked, right? We have many asked who had predicted this, and it was very interesting. There was even this tweet saying, oh, who could have predicted this? Basically, every epidemiologist, every disease ecologist, there was no really a surprise. And it was interesting because as a political scientist and a professional in international relations, I thought it was relatively interesting I was maybe had many warnings. And I remember here the World Health Summit in Berlin in 2019, when you had the head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, saying a pandemic is not a matter of if, but when. This was just also a few months before COVID-19. And this was so very interesting I found initially hard to see how someone like me with this discipline background in international relations, how could I really contribute to the field of health? But as in environmental affairs, we know the knowledge does not automatically translate into action. So with the science of planetary health, I'm trying to focus on the opportunities to expand this field into actionable recommendations for decision makers. And that's something that I see a gap a little bit in the studies in this field. And my concern is how we should then not waste a good crisis and build this long-term social and ecological resilience. So I want to move to some suggestions of this empowering, perhaps new roadmap for a safer, more just post-COVID world. But let's begin then, what is planetary health? And I think like a good academic will say, oh, it depends. There are long debates about the meaning of the planetary health, which I would not like to spend too much time on this, because for me, the important is not so much the label, but this the essence of the field. And planetary health is then a refined way, perhaps, to think public health in the Anthropocene. It has strong roots in ecology, systems thinking, history of environmental movement as well. And of course, the concept gained force in 2015 with this launch of the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission on Planetary Health. So what is really important here is that planetary health focuses on how human-induced change in our Earth systems impact human health and well-being. So why planetary health emerges? Science suggests that infinite growth is not a good idea. First, perhaps for strategic reasons, given that resources such as fossil fuels are not infinite. But second, also this addition to fossil fuels that are really accelerating climate change, troubling our well-being. And that's perhaps the paradox of planetary health. The same pathway that gave us a lot of improvement in public health is now being framed as a threat. So we could say that, are we becoming victims of our own success? That's one of the debates and what it really, I think, launched, if we call planetary health this new field. So the problem is that this health environment nexus, at least in the era of policymakers, has been neglected for too long. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, there were also many reports from the World Health Organization, from the United Nations Environmental Program, outlining how, for example, nearly 25% of our global deaths are related to economic decisions affecting the environment. Then we have these numbers that we constantly hear, how more than 7 million people die from air quality, but also 3.5 million dying from poor water quality as well. As we know how in times of pandemic, this advice of just wash your hands is not a reality in more than half of the world. Chemical exposure also costly nearly $1 trillion in near development effects, specifically in middle and low-income countries. We have microplastics affecting our food systems. We have nutrient excess from farm runoffs, perhaps creating and increasing the threats with antimicrobial resistance. Zoonotic diseases impact and health economic development, but these are overlapping crises that I think I will discuss a little bit more soon. So the key point here is that the current crisis that we are living, I don't like to frame this as a health crisis. I think it's this ensemble of crises. It's perhaps not a pandemic, but an ecosystemic. And of course, we're living in complex times, and as complexity is a long-term paradox of problem solving, as anthropologist Joseph Tinto says, and it facilitates the resolution of problems in the short run, but while undermining the ability to solve them in the long term. So maintaining a society or other kind of institutions requires that problem-solving systems itself be sustainable. So one of the biggest questions of our time is, how can we really decarbonize our societies? And what would it take for degrowth, this paradigm really shift to take place? And the current pandemic cannot ignore these questions. And since the resources we use today, we really define who we are tomorrow. And when it comes to decarbonization, we are really riding what we call, it's a bumpy road, right? Contemporary critical political economy scholarships, they're saying there are 4 prerequisites for social economic paradigms shift. We have a deep crisis that perhaps that's where we're living, an alternative political project, a comprehensive coalition of social forces promoting this project in political struggles, and a broad-based consent. But on one hand, there is much to suggest that this current crisis cannot be resolved under existing institutional frameworks, and that degrowth is a political project that provides solutions to some of the key problems that we are facing. But on the other hand, this prospects for a degrowth paradigm shift remain very bleak. And unlike these political projects that became hegemonic in the past, degrowth has neither support from a comprehensive coalition of social forces, nor any consent to its agenda among the broader population. That's one of the challenges that we face. So if you put it briefly, why decarbonization or a better path towards planetary health is not happening. We could here outline 3 main points, is that most narratives of well-being do not support decarbonization. We still have, in terms of values, a very different view that what is a well-being today. It's perhaps still disconnected, and we have these long discussions about how do we measure our economies on GDP. There are so many experts also dealing with this. And the public perception of urgency remains very low, and of course not mainstream. We're still usually talking to our friends in our bubbles, and all these questions seem very obvious, but if you go out there, of course it's a much less, we find less evidence on this. And of course, finally, vested interest delaying action to transform our economies. But meanwhile, we have 1 million species face extinction. The primary cause, of course, being loss and degradation of natural systems. What we have the famous book of journalist Elizabeth Kolbert, The Sixth Extinction. And this ecological degradation also increases the risk of zoonotic diseases outbreaks. So that's one of the main, I think, conclusions we're having now, but very curious to see how our other experts today think about this. And climate change reinforces the problem of biodiversity loss. So while these pathogens responsible for such spillover may originate in the wildlife host, their emergence is really driven by this human endeavor. So this includes the conversion of our forests for human use in areas of high biodiversity and wildlife trade, especially the live wildlife close to large urban centers. One of the solutions we hear today is really not only to stop this war against nature, but undertaking restoration of nature. Not an easy task. So planetary health, to me, is really about prevention. It is about avoiding the use of emergency plans, like we see now with the desperation production of vaccines. And this prevention seems to be cost effective. If you have preventative actions such as disease monitoring, retained forest cover, reductions in interspecies transmissions, regulation of the wild meat trade, for example, combating illegal wildlife trade. And they're estimated that you would need perhaps $22 to $31 billion annually to do that, which is much less than all the mortality and economic loss that we are having with the pandemic and these days. So, which is now, I think we're estimating at $8 to $10 trillion. So similarly, health savings from policies that reduce air pollution are projected to be even greater, 23 trillion over the long term, according to United Nations Environmental Program. So these data are compelling. They need to be, of course, further examined and perhaps replicated in other sectors. But despite the scale, the knowledge, and the urgency to tackle this transnational global challenge, now we see that pandemic is a global transnational problem, very much linked, I believe, to this unsustainable development patterns. We continue to observe a fragmented response to the pandemic. So perhaps we would need to respond to this crisis, an adaptive leadership. And leadership is really what seems to be missing in our world these days. We would need these 4 A's. I would say it's anticipation of likely future needs, trends, and options, articulation of these needs to build collective understanding and support for action, adaptation, so there is a continuous learning and adjustments of responses as necessary, right? It's not this linear a line there. And this accountability, including maximum transparency in decision-making processes. So timing is everything, and that's why this crisis could be a really turning point. But I would like to focus now on this third and final part on this human dimension of the health crisis, which is connected, as I explained, to this attack against nature. So one of the key messages that planetary health requires overcoming the systemic social barriers to accelerate this fair recovery. And we see that we talk a lot about an economic recession, what I like to call it a she-cession. There is COVID-19 really exacerbating social stagnation, impacting women disproportionately, while widening the long existing, not known and not really novelty, the gender pay gap. But we now have concrete numbers from the World Bank in 2021. And although women represent 39% of the global workforce, they accounted for 54% of this pandemic-related job losses. So also you see only in the United States, 2.3 million of the women having completely dropped out of the labor force. Just to give a comparison, men is 1.8 million. And if you see who are really the chronically hungry nowadays, is women and girls, 70%. So of course this crisis, it's multifaceted. And how do we then move to what do we want to call perhaps a green and fair recovery? Of course, we need all cross-sectoral approach to this. And that's why I think this women and the environment discussion is very important. If we move to Asia and the Pacific, where they are the most disaster prone in the world, we see that over 500 million poor people are currently living at this medium to high disaster risk areas. Climate change, of course, could force more than 100 million people into extreme poverty by 2030. But women in the region, they outnumber men as workers in many natural resource reliant industries. And that's perhaps the connection here. So they comprise 66% of total workers in large scale marine fisheries, for example, 54% of workers in small scale marine fisheries, and 95% of people engaged in fish farming. So, and I think one of my goals here is like, what's the recommendation for policymakers? Is that we need to break down the systemic barriers and the root cause of unsustainable development. And in the case of gender, we have to address gender inequalities and access to and control over natural resources if we want to accelerate the impact of planetary health or sustainable development policies. And another recommendation is the replacement of laws and regulations and policies that discriminate against women with those promoting gender equality. Really, this could help us to achieve at least not the perfect, but the plan that we have, which is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right, by 2030. And you think, oh, just changing regulations perhaps, but let's remember there is 155 countries nowadays that have regulations that are discriminating women economically somehow. So it's not just 10 little lost countries that we're talking about. So a third point here is enabling women's participation and decision-making at all levels remain overlooked. That's not something that perhaps we consider as a problem, but is really a step towards these transformative policies. So to fully implement planetary health, I think we also will need to do an exercise to unlearn our privilege. And I think with this pandemic gives a lot of space to do this exercise and enlarge our understanding of these root causes, because what we are experiencing is a very global challenge, right? But the brains thinking about the solutions remain very localized. And by this, I mean that the global South remains excluded from the design of our future. And I want to just give a few numbers that I found this week. Researchers doing a survey of more than 1,000 papers on ecology and conservation, saying that of these 42 countries specified as the affiliations of the top publishing authors, 3 account for a disproportionately large number. So of course, the United States, 40%, the United Kingdom, 18%, and Australia, 9%. And then you have the next 7, Canada, Germany, France, Switzerland, Netherlands, Spain, and Sweden. Germany and Canada with 4%, France with 3%, and the others 2%. So all this to say that these 10 countries together, they account for 86% of the top publishing authors in areas that are very also essential for planetary health. So of course, it's notable that the top 3 countries are English speaking. They are Western countries of the global North. Then we have the problem of biased top authorship. This findings in the same more than 1,000 papers, we have 11% there are authors that are women. So the authors of the study conclude that the lists of top publishing authors in ecology, evolution, and conservation science are still biased by underrepresentation of women and scientists from the global South. And of course, this reduced diversity of academic leadership in these fields. So by having diverse leaders with different perspectives, we can better resolve international environmental problems. That's not necessarily a very new and revolutionary finding, but it's still not happening. And we do believe that's also one of the parts of the solutions for the climate change and biodiversity loss. It's also a way to show, perhaps creates role models of next generations of scientists in the global South. So I do have a call to action here is to thus encourage the international scientific community, especially those in leadership positions, to proactively promote diversity and inclusion in all disciplines. And many opportunities for increasing this representation of women and scientists from the global South are very straightforward, not even expensive. But somehow, of course, we are here dealing with relations of power. So we need to promote awareness and try to really evaluate how this creates inequalities in scientific careers. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with the Women Leaders for Planetary Health, a social enterprise that I created in 2019. So in conclusion, what's the contribution of this planetary health narrative at the moment? Perhaps building an alternative to collapsology, as we tend to believe in now, and we do have options to get out of this crisis. So, however, we must remember that the capacity of institutions to solve problems changes over time, right? It's suggesting that a science of problem solving and thus a science of sustainability, planetary health, must be historical. But with this global depression and approaching the context of devastating pandemic, the planet is really in search of lost time, and it's urgent to find smarter ways to address these new threats. But if we look at the United Nations now celebrating 75 years, it was not built to solve transnational problems unless the most powerful states agreed. And at this critical moment, many states are acting in a counterproductive way, not helping, but perhaps inciting bad politics that leave everyone behind. And when it comes to solve the threats that are linked to public health and the environment. And the question is, could this $8 to $10 trillion and 10% drop in the global GDP, together with the terrifying deaths, help us to reform the 75-year-old institution that is supposed to ensure global peace? And if governments continue flexing these sovereign muscles amid popular nationalism that we are observing specifically with the pandemic, it's very clear that research institutions, intellectuals, and epistemic communities, like we had a conversation here at the beginnings, they will have to find new ways to define means of better global cooperation. So it was quoted, and I want to close here, is that the New York Times noted, while political leaders have locked their borders, scientists have been breaking theirs and creating a global collaboration like any in history. And that's here we have a great opportunity. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. de Paula. That was really inspirational and thought-provoking. I'd like to next invite Dr. Lynteris for the presentation.
Today I would like to present not so much a talk as a provocation. And this provocation has to do with a pandemic that has been studied a lot by historians. This is the third plague pandemic. And my provocation is what happens if we start looking at this pandemic not from the side of humans, so not as a pandemic in the proper sense of the term, but as a panzootic of rodents. So to give you some background, for those not familiar with the third pandemic had its origins maybe in the 1770s, we're not sure, in southwest China, in the province of Yunnan, of what was then the Qing Empire, with the first solid records of an epidemic of Yersinia pestis, of plague in this region, from the 1850s or 70s, again from Yunnan. So this then took another maybe 20 years or 25 years to reach the great cities of Canton and Hong Kong, which were very important trading hubs and harbors at the time. And there were massive outbreaks of the disease in 1894. And you can see an image of the Shropshire Regiment engaging in an effort to control the disease in Hong Kong at the time. And from there, it spread through maritime trade across the globe in all inhabited continents, not just in disease ports, but also inland and in rural areas, causing more than 12 million deaths in its global outbreak. The pandemic was then declared over by 1959 by the WHO. I apologize for this map. It has a very bad provenance, but it's the best map we have, which shows you more or less the global spread of the epidemic and some of the reservoirs that it established, about which I'm going to talk a little bit later. Now, as I said, this disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which was identified during the Hong Kong outbreak of 1894 by Alexander Yersin, a Pasteurian doctor. We now know that plague or Yersinia pestis establishes very complex disease ecologies in different ecosystems. These mainly include wild rodents and also peridomestic or even domestic rodents, but also other mammals such as camels, etc., with humans usually being the dead end of the disease. Now, of course, this complex disease ecology is a recent scientific achievement, its understanding, I mean. At the time of the third pandemic, there were endless debates about how disease spread and how it was maintained in given environments. However, it is safe to say that although rats were generally believed to be disease-free until 1894, during the first outbreak in Hong Kong that year, rats became framed as potential hosts of the disease, and a couple of months later, marmots were also framed, in this case in South Siberia by Russian doctors. So we have the beginning of framing of rodents as implicated in the spread and the maintenance of Yersinia pestis by the time of the first major outbreak. And this leads to complex epistemological history of determining the role of rats and other rodents in these processes. And this is rather complex as it involved not just rodents, but also other epistemic objects at the time, such as grain. So the question, is it actually rats that infect grain, or is it grain that infects rats and humans? Or the soil, could the soil be the actual true reservoir of the disease? Or cloths and fabrics, which were also framed as transmitting the disease. But also, what is the exact transmission pathway, even if the rat is admitted to be involved? People like William Simpson, up until 1905, maintained that it's mainly through the alimentary tract that plague is transmitted to rodents or between rodents, not fleas, which was the hypothesis proposed by Paul-Louis Simon, another Pasteurian, in 1898. However, it is safe to say that what we call the rat flea hypothesis, the idea that it's the Xenopsila chaopis flea, which is a parasite of rats that transmits plague from rats to humans, was pretty much stabilized by the 1920s. So what is missing from this story? There have been several stories and histories of local outbreaks and either the study of rats as implicated in these outbreaks, for example, in India or in Indochina, and of the control of rats and other rodents in various places in the world during the third pandemic. However, what we are missing, I think, in this picture is a more global historical understanding of the third plague pandemic as a rodent panzootic. And I have a question mark there, because I'm sure that biologists could disagree, and they would be right too. I'm not a biologist, but so this is a provocation. So what do I mean by a rodent panzootic? Well, what I mean is a process through which rats and other rodents infect one another, let's say, on a global scale in a limited time frame. And I would say that this, it's safe to assume this time frame to be between 1894 and, say, the mid-1910s, let's say, possibly longer than that. But after the mid-1910s, plague outbreaks become less frequent across the globe. So let's take that slice of the timeline as kind of more convincing for this scenario. And during that time, we have rats carried by steamers, by boats, infecting rats in ports across the world. So you would have a rat boarding a boat in Hong Kong and ending up in Sydney and infecting other rats in the docks of Sydney, San Francisco, etc., etc. We have rats carried by trains, which infect rats inland. And we have rats infecting other peridomestic rodents, which may or may not be good transmitters of plague or good reservoirs of plague, but they do get infected. Also, we have, and this is perhaps the most important point, rats and perhaps other peridomestic rodents infecting wild rodents, such as ground squirrels and gerbils. And I'm going to explain why this is very important. Now, especially the Well, the first point, rats spreading plague amongst other rats, establishes medium-term urban reservoirs of the disease, such as in Hong Kong, where the plague outbreaks occur on an annual basis between 1894 until 1926, if I remember correctly, with 1 year perhaps not having a plague outbreak. And the general consensus among biologists and medics at the time is that there are permanent populations of plague-infected rats in the colony. At the same time, the spread of plague from rats to wild rodents establishes long-term sylvatic reservoirs, and many of these are still with us today. And this involves also the establishment of plague in rodent populations in previously unaffected regions and continents. This is a quite well-known map from Moore in 1951, which shows the spread of plague in wild rodents in the United States by 1949. Plague arrives in San Francisco in California for the first time in 1900. That's a little black pointy spot at the very west. And from rats, which come with boats and infect local rats, the plague spreads to ground squirrels, and then it spreads all the way to this line, which I think, well, I'm not very, I think it's Colorado, the Rocky Mountains, New Mexico, Arizona, etc. This is another example. This is a map published in 1945, where you see in the horizontal lines the Sylvatic plague reservoirs established at the time, and you will see that, for example, South America has such reservoirs where plague had not been present before the 1900s, or parts of Africa, etc., etc. And this is the current or more recent map by the WHO of Sylvatic plague reservoirs or natural foci of plague across the globe. A lot of these are old, such as the Inner Asia and Central Asia ones, but the American ones, for example, are new. They are the product of the third pandemic, or the great panzootic, as we may call it. Now, my project that Christoph mentioned, the Global War Against the Rat and the Epistemic Emergence of Zoonosis, is interested in understanding how, during the third plague pandemic, rats became objects of study, but also objects of public health control, and how the two processes interact with one another. Now, this is important because the study of rats and other rodents in the relation to plague was catalytic in the establishment of zoonosis as a scientific field, and in key notions about zoonosis, which are still with us today. And to give you very quickly 3 examples, one is the idea that epizootics, in the case of rats, we call them ratfalls, are catalytic for human infection. Another idea is the role of species invasiveness in new territories as a driver of the spread of zoonotic diseases in these territories. And the third is ideas about disease reservoirs. And in this, it's more wild rodents that are important. Now, these ideas and more are very important in the field of zoonosis as they allow us to understand the relation between temporal and spatial patterns of zoonotic transmission and maintenance, and the interrelation between different species in given ecosystems. And it is, I think, by studying the third plague pandemic as a panzootic that we can start understanding exactly how this global spread of the disease among different populations of rodents and different rodent species affected ecosystems across the globe. This is something that has not been studied to any satisfactory extent. How, in other words, the introduction of a new disease in many cases, or large and competent populations of infected rats or other rodents in perhaps areas where plague had existed before but was not as prevalent, had an impact on the ecosystem itself. But to understand this, we also need to understand how humans reacted to once they had an idea that rats and other rodents were hosts of the disease. And their reaction was very, very aggressive and very, very interconnected on a global level. And that's why we call it the global war against the rat. It's actually an emic term, it's not our term. Other historians have used it, but what's important is that people at the time were using that term. Now, the control of rodents took different forms, including fumigation, which was used both against rats and wild rodents. And Lucas Engelman and myself have written a book called Sulfuric Utopias on the use of fumigation in maritime trade to control rats. This was a global technology involving different machines and different chemicals, which had an enormous effect on global trade. A second method was rat catching, which involved various different groups of individuals, from professional rat catchers to bounty rat catching in the colonies, which, as Michael Van has shown, led to farming rats by colonial subjects who then sold the rats to the colonial authorities. Rat proofing, which saw a vast transformation of the built environment across the globe. Zoning, so creating zones free of specific species of animals, of rodents more particularly, which were believed to be carrying plague. And Jules Cotness-Brown has shown how this was applied in South Africa. Poisoning, both rats and wild rodents. Animal technologies, as several historians have shown, cats and dogs used again against rats. And microbiological technologies, the Danis virus in particular, for the control of rats. Now, all these things taken together had a major impact on societies themselves. So they had a major impact on human-rodent relations. They completely reconfigured these relations. They had a major impact on trade, on forms of habitation. For example, here we have an example of a photograph of bamboo, which was framed as an ideal rat nest in the Dutch East Indies, in Java. And Maurits Meerwijk he has written about this, and his paper is going to be included in the book that Christoph mentioned, how framing bamboo, which is a native form of, a native material used in vernacular architecture in Java at the time, then led to the massive destruction of native homes and the replacement by timber across the Dutch East Indies, which then created relations of debt to the colony. So from having a material such as bamboo, which is readily available in bamboo groves, you can just cut some bamboo and fix the roof of your house. Bamboo is no longer allowed. You have to buy timber from the Dutch, and you can only do this by becoming indebted to them. And then it's basically you have to work for the rest of your life in order to pay off the debt so that you can have a rat-proof house. But a part of these immense impacts that the global war against the rat had on societies, it also had an impact on urban and rural ecosystems for various ways. One way that you can easily see here is a massive reduction, for example, in the use of bamboo in some areas of the world, as bamboo became a forbidden material. Or the increase of toxicity with a massive use of poisons in other parts of the world. Or zoning, where an entire species became purged from these circular zones around Johannesburg and other cities. Or in the case of the United States or the Soviet Union, the war against squirrels or marmots using some incredible machines or even hydrocyanic gases, which of course led to massive disturbances in local ecosystems. Now, taking all these things in consideration, and in order to be able to appreciate how different governments and different societies reacted to this idea of the rat as what following Janice Sodikoff we may call a pandemic infrastructure, we also need to consider the role of the rats in what I like to call the pandemic imaginary. And most of you will be familiar with Marie Fay Gedge's work on the Gothification of plague in the 20th century. And we're very fortunate to have Nükhet here, who's written a fantastic new paper on the idea of the Black Death, which is also included in that volume that Christoph mentioned, which is coming out soon. But what we need to think is, what is the social life of this idea, this Gothified idea of plague, this Gothified idea of the Black Death in the 20th century as a result of the third plague pandemic? And what is the role of the rat in maintaining and transforming this idea? The rat being an already Gothic animal in European imagination, but also in kind of a recursive way, how this pandemic imaginary impacts human-rodent relations on the ground. So how does this pathologization and Gothification of the rat renders rats into epidemic villains in various social contexts? How do local communities respond to this Gothification and villainization of the rat? And what impact does this have on the actual rodent ecosystems on the ground? So to conclude, and I know we're running out of time, my proposal here is that if we start seeing the pandemic as rodent panzootic in the case of the third pandemic, then we may be able to appreciate 4 different aspects of this pandemic, which are not very prevalent in the existing histories of the pandemic. First is the impact on disease ecology, but also on ecology more broadly. Second is the impact on the development of the science of zoonotic diseases, or the scientific notion about zoonotic diseases. Third is the impact of rodents and their control on social and economic life. And fourth is the impact of framing rats as epidemic villains on the pandemic imaginary, and perhaps even in the emergence of the pandemic itself as a notion or as an experience, which happens for the first time during the third pandemic. The third plague pandemic is the first pandemic where this notion becomes really a popular notion, both in medicine and in lay publications. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lynteris. That was really amazing. I have so many of these images of rats now in my head, and as we are moving along with them, I'd like to invite Dr. Varlık to set up her PowerPoint. So the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for my co-panelists as well, and everyone joining us today. So I would like to thank my co-panelists, especially Christos, because most of what he said is very relevant for my presentation. Again, I'm staying with the subject of plague, but many of the ecological dynamics that he mentioned are just going to make my life easier in this conversation. All right, so I would like to start by a short piece that I wrote this past fall before the vaccine rollout, and when everybody was wondering about, how will this or when and how this will pandemic end. And so I suggested that we look back at history and think about the different kinds of pathogens that we have had experience with in human history, and looking at their behavior, perhaps we can tell something about the behavior of this new pathogen. And in fact, it is quite depressing to realize that smallpox is the only human virus that has been entirely eradicated from the world. And virtually almost every other pathogen that has been introduced to the human disease repertoire has stayed with us. And in fact, plague is one of them. And in the case of smallpox, let's quickly add that because there was no known animal host, and it took, of course, a very organized effort, a global effort for vaccination to eradicate it, but it's not the case for most other zoonotic infections that have animal hosts. And in fact, one of the most important problems we are facing today with the COVID-19 pandemic is the possibility of wildlife being infected with this virus. And we already have evidence of zoo animals, pets, and in mink farms, we have evidence of transmission. And so the biggest threat awaiting us, and in fact, it should be part of the conversation, that if the virus affects wildlife, this again would turn into another pathogen that will become impossible to eradicate. And so I wanted to use that the moment that we're in today and the connections of this new emerging infectious diseases and the pathogen that causes it with plague, and thinking about plague as, in the same way, an emerging infectious disease that has zoonotic origins, but also a very good model to bring here, because we know that the bacterium that causes plague, Yersinia pestis, started affecting human societies, affected human societies at least for the last 5,000 years, but it is still with us today. So I'd like to emphasize that long-term persistence of this disease in human societies. And in fact, the recent outbreak that we may not have heard about because of all the COVID effect of masking other outbreaks, but more than 500 people were infected with plague, and 31 people died in the Democratic Republic of Congo very recently. And in fact, just reminding us that this disease is still causing outbreaks. And only a few years ago, there was another major outbreak of plague in Madagascar that resulted in the death of more than 200 people. In fact, since the 1970s, we've had numerous cases of human plague in the US and elsewhere in the world. I'm showing the same map that Christos just showed, and basically, indicating the locations of known and older plague reservoirs. And in fact, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, since Christos laid out all these mechanisms so beautifully and eloquently in terms of the rodents and the wild rodents, especially their role as maintenance and amplifying hosts, and the transitory role of other animals and rats and commensal rodents and pets in transmitting, and of course fleas and other disease vectors in transmitting to humans. And in fact, I think it would be appropriate here to remind everyone that plague has a very complex etiology that has been only better understood in the last century or so. So it's a zoonotic disease that requires us to shift our attention outside of the human agency. And again, just following up on the words of Christos, I think it makes more sense to think of the agency of animals, rodents, and other mammals as perhaps the main actors, right? So shifting the methodological lens here from a human-centered perspective to animals, and in fact also to include climate fluctuations, changes in the populations of the hosts and the vectors, and taking into consideration ecological disturbances, human-induced ecological disturbances, and the human agency, all as part of a system that we need to take into consideration. And in fact, on that note, I think I should also add that most of the plague scholarship, at least in the historical scholarship, has emphasized prominently the human agency, and yet it has shortcomings in trying to understand the complexity of this disease in human history. And here I would like to note very briefly that historians have started to tackle with this question of how plague can remain active in the natural environment as a result of the agency of rodents. Here I'm referring to the pioneering work of historian Anne Carmichael, who published this paper in the year 2014, making an important point of the role of alpine marmots and perhaps other rodent hosts in maintaining plague in Western Europe. In fact, we have more scientific evidence from paleogenetics that supported this persistence in Europe and asking new questions. And here I would like to shift our attention from Europe to the Ottoman Empire. And first of all, making this very basic point that the Ottoman Empire is actually a very good model, a good example, a good case study to understand, to study the history of plague, simply because we're dealing with a very long time period of the presence of plague, basically full 600 years. And in fact, of course, as important as it is to understand plague persistence in Europe and trying to identify the mechanisms that supported it, we have a shorter window to study the history of plague in Europe. And in fact, if we shift the geographic attention to areas that have been less understood and less studied, we have a chance to bring in new insights. So I would like to shift the focus to the Ottoman Empire, and again, just simply justifying this by the fact that we have evidence for the persistence of a disease for 600 years, and we have documentation to support this persistence. So for that reason, I think it would be a helpful model, if nothing else, to frame the discussion. In my earlier work, I've worked on the Black Death pandemic and the recurrent waves of the second pandemic of plague in the Ottoman Empire, and basically identifying the different networks along which plague spread in the Ottoman Empire, trying to diversify the distinction, the discussion that had been centered mostly on Europe. And this book was published in 2015. And since then, there's new research coming out trying to integrate the areas outside of Europe, the plague experience of societies outside of Europe, and trying to understand the relationship and the interaction between them. And in fact, I am now working on a new project which will tell us about the Ottoman experience of plague after the year 1600, and which I was not able to cover in my first book. Looking at the introduction, spread of a plague in the Ottoman Empire, there are a couple of very basic points that we might want to remember here. One of them being that the Ottoman Empire, from its initial emergence in the early 14th century, throughout the centuries of the late medieval and early modern period, expanded geographically at a very fast pace, actually, in the 15th and 16th centuries. So that geographic expansion brought also the phenomenon of the establishment of an early modern empire, establishing all the different forms of connections between areas that had not been previously connected in ways that made it possible for plague to spread to new locations and also intensify those connections. Let me go back to this map just for a second to make the point that some of these connections already existed before the emergence of the Ottoman Empire, and so they intensified, but some of them were newly established to basically the operationalization, the day-to-day operationalization of an early modern empire. So you have the establishment of administrative networks, you have trade and communication networks, you have military networks, so all of these connections that made it possible to rule an empire, a large land empire whose territories, were in the Balkans, Black Sea region, Anatolia, Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa. So we're talking about, geographically large and also ecologically diverse landscape. And so as I said, one factor we need to think about is the establishment of these connections that facilitated the spread of plague, and perhaps as a byproduct of the emergence of this empire. Another phenomenon is that we need to keep in mind is the emergence of new urban centers and the expansion of existing urban centers, and so urbanization as an important phenomenon underlying the 16th century in particular, which was very important to understand the demographic dynamics of recurrence and reoccurrence of plague in many regions. And last, I would like to emphasize the role of Istanbul becoming almost a plague hub for not only the Ottoman Empire, but almost the larger Mediterranean world in the late 16th century, and performing this role for quite some time in being situated at the convergence of different types of networks that plague circulated alone, but at the same time having this effect of being one of the largest cities of the Mediterranean world in the 17th, starting in the late 16th and 17th centuries, with a population of at least 700,000 people, if not more, and just creating this new urban reservoir for the disease, and also facilitating its connection from one point of the empire to another one. So having said that, the next challenge that I am now facing is to understand how these plague went through different phases or transformations within the empire's history, and more importantly, how to explain its gradual disappearance, right? And so when we look at the historical debates, and also some scientific attempts to understand or explain the disappearance or extinction of a plague from Europe. And we also see that there is a great emphasis placed on human agency. Human societies have imposed quarantines, isolation practices, have created cleaner cities. And so this is something that is presented as an explanation for the disappearance of a plague. In fact, looking at the Ottoman Empire, I think we have a chance to complicate this human-centered narrative by introducing animals and the role of the larger the environment in understanding how the disease persisted for such a long time and how it retreated. So for that, I would like to shift the attention now to, and this was, of course, from early 20th century, when knowledge of plague had already been accepted, established in the international scientific community, and the same in the Ottoman Empire, when rats and fleas had been recognized as the main agents in this discussion. But this becomes, it's this early 20th century, as I said, but when you go back in time, this becomes very difficult. And here I would like to present a possible actor in the story that has not been recognized. And in fact, there are many other rodents that we talk about. I just like bringing up the jerboa here as an example, because jerboas have become locally extinct or extirpated from the areas that the Ottoman Empire ruled historically, though in certain parts of Syria, Iraq, and the Persian Gulf, we still have the presence of at least some species of this the small rodent. But in Turkey, in Anatolia, Balkans, we don't have we don't have evidence that they still exist, right? So, but in some of the historical sources that I worked with, there is evidence that these animals were actually present in that area. So I was trying to understand the relationship between rodents, especially small rodents and wild rodents that we know are plague carriers, and the dynamics of plague. And here, the main reason that I like bringing up the example of the jerboa is because even though it was believed to be extinct, now, thanks to cell phone camera, we have recent sightings of jerboas, at least 3 or 4 in the last 2 years from Turkey. And because it's kind of such an unusual animal that it, catches the attention. And so now we actually can see that it hasn't disappeared completely, and also making it possible for us to think that it also had a historical population. And here we can multiply the examples to other small rodents that may have, or other species of jerboas or other small rodents that may have played a role in this complex picture. And here I would like to show just a few for us to think, but it is not only limited to the small rodents, while other wildlife, other wild animals also part of the conversation. And here I would like to ask this very basic question as I show you some miniature work coming from the classical period of the Ottoman Empire from the 16th century. So most of these artworks have been produced in contexts that have nothing to do with zoology, but I think they might also help us see at least some of the biological diversity that the empire hosted. And here I would like to ask this question that we have evidence that a very large number of wild animals, wildlife existed in this geography. And we also know that the decline in biological diversity, especially in Anatolia, has been fastest. The process of biological extinction has been fastest in the world, with the extinction or near extinction of many plant and animal species. And so how do we think about this process of the loss of biological diversity in this region and the disappearance of plague? So I would like to propose that if we want to think about the loss of biological diversity, especially in the way it can tell us about the larger changes that was taking place in that natural environment, I think we might establish some of these connections in the pre-modern world, where we don't have the sources like we have in the modern period that will make those connections explicit. But some of these can still be researched, and we using the knowledge that we have from modern plague ecology studies, it should be possible to at least establish the basic mechanisms of these relationships. And so I would like to point out just a few basic mechanisms that may have been important in this process. And the first and foremost among these is the unsustainable resource extraction of especially 18th and 19th century Ottoman empire. And so we have evidence of the existence of, at least, looking at the hunting manuals here, and also later on, not only hunting manuals, but hunting laws and photography in the modern period can all help us learn more about the existence of wildlife and the kinds of wild animals that lived in this part of the world that you don't have anymore, especially over the course of the 20th century. Most of these have become extinct. Snow leopards and tigers and many other larger mammals, especially in the late 20th century, have become extinct. And hunting, of course, is the #1 driver of this process, but also as far as small rodents, small mammals involved, I think fur, using of these animals for fur trade and for food also may have been part of the discussion. And here, as I said, I would like to finish by suggesting that it's important to think about the pre-modern resource extraction mechanisms, and especially with modernization in the 19th century, how unsustainable ways of resource extraction may have accelerated the process of loss of biological diversity. And here I would like to underline the importance of deforestation, especially we have evidence of that process, but at the same time, perhaps the intensification of cash crops agriculture. In fact, we have Alexander Schopo here in the audience, so I would like to give him a shout out for his work on the introduction of rice agriculture in the Ottoman Empire, in the Ottoman Balkans especially, and how it accelerated, how it changed the disease ecologies of the regions that was introduced. And so it should be possible to look at these changing land use and agriculture patterns in other parts of the empire, and questioning how this may have had an impact on the disease ecologies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Varlık. That was so informative, and also it gives us a new understanding of the role of animals here in the history of plague and pandemics. What I'd like to do next is invite our 3 panelists to please unmute and join together for a bit of a conversation.
Right. Maybe I can react, since it was fascinating. Thank you so much for bringing this perspectives, and it's a great honor to learn from you. And I have so many questions, but I also don't have a lot of time, so I just wanted to make one comment, because I'm very interested in this perspective. When you go back to 14th century, and now if you had a call to policymakers today, what kind of lessons could we take then and say that? Would you have a key message to say, comparing to all these learnings, what could we say, what are the lessons that we could, in the way we're dealing with this pandemic, or perhaps in the narrative or the discourses that we're talking about? I found interesting also when we talk about the villainization of the rat, and how it's perhaps historically, I'm not the expert, but you have many of this othering, right? When you have a virus, and perhaps the political context at the moment, or culturally speaking, there was a tendency to see that's from abroad, or a blaming game. And of course, during this pandemic, we saw a lot of this politicization with the Chinese virus that caused, of course, a lot of problems and beyond the health dimension. So I would like to just, maybe if you can build a little bit on this. How do we connect to the discourses that we're having on the media or from our policymakers, and what could we do better? It's an easy question, no?
I can go ahead. Do we have an order, or are we collecting questions first?
No, go ahead. Please go ahead and address each other. That's
okay.
Fine.
Well, thank you. So I think, the question of lessons is something that relates to, very closely related, I think, to the legacy that pandemics leave behind. And in a way, for me at least, it was surprising to see how some of the older narratives about pandemics have been again revived during COVID-19. And in a way, of course, we all watched it with horrors. Those of us especially specializing in the study of past pandemics, how othering, xenophobia and all that just, coming up again, China virus, Chinese virus, foreign virus, again, just, encapsulates that, unfortunately, perfectly. But in my own research, I look at the evolution of the arguments about, othering the disease, othering the experiences of other societies, but in a way also villainizing them. And that's why I found your comment about Brazil being seen as a global threat very helpful, because it makes me rethink my sources, especially in the 19th century with the international sanitary conferences and organization of international efforts to contain disease. Well, it was basically to protect the health of certain countries in the world, mainly Europe in that context in the 19th century. But, I also appreciate how you made the distinction between, the global health efforts benefiting the global north, where we still have these problems, continuing, of course, in the global south. So on that, if I may, I would like to just, open it up to question. Of course, I found most of what you said very helpful and thought-provoking in rethinking historical arguments, especially how you kind of unpack the diversity and equity issues in global research. Right. And in a way, I think it would be helpful for us as historians to exercise the same kind of unpacking in trying to disentangle the different kinds of voices in our historical sources. And in fact, some voices are overwhelmingly, at least in the kind of material that I'm using, some of them are overwhelmingly loud, whereas others are very difficult to hear. And I think this is really an open-ended discussion about how we can learn about how we unpack those issues in the present day and how they can help us understand or better understand or appreciate our historical sources.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I'm generally a bit uncomfortable with the idea of lessons of history, or rather, as an anthropologist, I take it ethnographically, and I'm interested on why people are interested in it. But I think there is definitely a warning there. If you look at the historical record of the third pandemic, especially with regards to the establishment of Sylvatic reservoirs, and because we now know that SARS-CoV-2 spreads from mink to at least wild mink, and potentially the paper that I've read is not peer-reviewed yet, to deer mice in the USA. So the immediate question that this poses, especially given how badly regulated mink farming is in the US by contrast to the EU, for example, where most of the farms are now shut down, and because of the whole capitalist economy in the US, which makes it very difficult to shut down these places, whether we are looking in the future, in the 10 years, the establishment of Sylvatic COVID in the USA, right, which will happen under the radar because no one is focusing on this at the moment. Everyone thinks this is a pandemic and not a panzootic in any way. No one is interested in that aspect of the disease. Of course, there are limited resources, and we are in an incredibly difficult situation. So it's difficult to ask from governments and scientists to focus on animals at this stage, right? But this is exactly how, in the past, this lack of attention to animals in California, for example, led to the spread of the disease to wild rodents, and then to the establishment of natural reservoirs. Now, this is a possibility, and I know that there have been several papers in the past month and in popular science magazines and in Wire last week about this. So there is more attention to this right now, and I wish we can amplify this, because that would be an incredible threat to public health, right? This virus circulating amongst different wild animal species, and of course with each spillover you have increased chances of mutation, and this is a catastrophic scenario, right? That we may have to live with this virus emerging and re-emerging from these animals, just because some people want to use vison, right? I don't know how do you call that in English, the mink fair, right? Which is a completely needless thing based on animal cruelty, etc., etc., etc. Right? Actually, and if you want a warning from history, we've seen that before in the Manchurian plague epidemic of 1910, which was the direct result of demand for marmot fur as imitation sable from London and Leipzig, which led to the industrial hunt of marmots in Manchuria and Mongolia, and to the spillover of plague into humans, and then this massive outbreak in the region. So it's not the first time that capitalist demand for fur would be creating an epidemic, right? We've seen that before. So maybe not a lesson, but definitely a warning.
That's very interesting. It makes me think about when you talk about the regulations, it's really the norm setting from now on. It's an essential topic, and who is going to create these norms or establish what is normal, not normal, what should be regulated, what should not be regulated. Of course, there are this power dynamics again, as always in history, and it's the paradox perhaps is we keep hearing we are in this together, right? And we see that it's not really true. The example of women is one, but also in terms of the differences between countries. We are so privileged to be here on Zoom discussing this and going back, in history, making this analysis. And of course, that's not the digital gap that we're going to have after this pandemic. It's going to be so dramatic. So the solutions that we might imagine for many of us, how much this will be a solution for the rest of the world. And the paradox perhaps is it's so global and bringing again to this era of international relations that we do need multilateral solutions and this coordination. And it's perhaps now the moment that we are, this is failing us the most. And although we want to be optimistic about the perception that we need to coordinate this in a more actionable way and for the benefit of the whole planet, that's not what we are seeing at the moment, right? There is also this retrocession and rising in nationalism and even potentially the dangers to democracy. That's something, there are many open questions. There was a bit of a main question also to ask about the lessons. It's too early, of course, to know, but we can, again, as I said, some warnings are here and we can imagine some of these consequences.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our panelists, Dr. de Paula, Varlık, and Lynteris, for this energizing and motivating set of presentations. I think it really helps us understand the kind of forefront of research and the ongoing issues that connect development of our human environments shared also with non-humans, the gendered aspects of understanding planetary health as well, and new images that we have and understandings about animals in the Panzootic and in the pre-modern eras that give us some challenges and raises the bar for how research can be done collaboratively and over the different time periods and over different regions. I want to thank everybody here, the audience, for joining us today. We will reconvene on April 20th, and I'll be passing on the privilege of chairing this colloquium series to my colleague Pablo Ruiz de Olano for the topic Pandemic Polities, Science Governance in Democratic and Authoritarian Regimes, where we will be joined by panelists Annalisa Allers and Lino Campubi. So thank you again for being here today and sharing your time with us, everybody. Thanks very much. See you very soon.